All right, so in considering why there is seemingly mostly unanimous agreement within Truman's cabinet that if the bomb is successfully developed, they will use it, leading up to his realization on July 16th that the bomb has been successfully detonated. Why is there this unanimity within the cabinet? We want to keep in mind two considerations. The first is that the United States was already conducting a very, very brutal campaign against Japanese civilians. We were firebombing Japanese cities in really a barbaric way, all right? This had begun in February of 1945, and it was done under the direction of Curtis LeMay, who was brought in to command the 21st Bomber Command in Guam, and he was brought in from the European theater, where he had overseen the firebombing of Regensburg in Germany. And he had come to the conclusion that precision bombing, that is, bombing that aims to avoid civilian casualties, was really a waste of time, right? He says, quote, "I'll tell you what this war is about. You've got to kill people. And when you've killed enough, they will stop fighting," end quote. Those are his words. That is his philosophy. And he brings this philosophy into the Pacific theater in terms of American strategy, importing it from Europe, where the British and Americans had been conducting a pretty brutal campaign against German civilians for a while. But he brings it into the Pacific theater, and he has two very powerful weapons at his command. He develops these enormously explosive incendiary devices that cause horrific firestorms when they are released over the Japanese cities. The Japanese cities are built primarily with structures made out of wood, so they're very vulnerable to incendiary material. And the purpose of these bombs that he's releasing, which there's a cocktail of things within these bombs that make them extremely flammable, but the purpose of them is to kill as many civilians or soldiers, people in general, as possible through suffocation and through heat. That's what a firestorm does. It sucks up all the air in an area as the fire spreads incredibly rapidly. It's terrifying. And he is dropping these bombs from the B-29 superfortresses. These were new aircraft developed by the Americans that dominated the skies over Japan in the final months of the war. By January 45, there were 350 of them in the Marianas Islands being used for these bombing campaigns of the Japanese cities. So LeMay comes in January 45, implements this really grim, wicked philosophy targeting civilians. And in February, in Tokyo alone, they kill 90,000 civilians. Over the next few months, in a number of Japanese cities, 900,000 civilians are killed by American bombing raids. So when we're thinking about the atomic bomb being detonated in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this was not a transition in terms of policy away from avoiding bombing civilians and now targeting civilians. No, we had been directly targeting civilians since February of 45 in a pretty reckless way, okay? So the Americans had already really made that very fateful decision, and that decision had been made before Truman came into the presidency, and it was just simply carried over. Now, the second consideration to keep in mind here is the commitment of the Japanese government and the Japanese people to resisting the demands of unconditional surrender. So on June 8th, 1945, over a month before Truman got the word about the bomb being successfully detonated, the Japanese government had recommitted itself to this policy of an absolute refusal to consider unconditional surrender. They would not consider any offer of ceasefire that did not secure the sovereignty of the homeland and the continuation of the imperial dynasty. And they said, quote, in their decision of June 8th, they said, quote, they would promise to, quote, prosecute the war to the bitter end in order to uphold the national polity, protect the imperial land, and accomplish the objectives for which we went to war, end quote. And one historian described this as a decision to commit mass suicide on the part of the Japanese government, similar to what the civilians had done in Saipan. Okay. And they make this decision while the fighting is still going on in Okinawa, and it's informing what's happening in Okinawa, because the soldiers and the civilians there are fighting to the bitter, bitter end. Okinawa fell in June 22nd, 1945, and the casualties there were staggering. Now, American deaths, there were about 7,600 American deaths on Okinawa. But the Americans had to kill 70,000 Japanese soldiers. They had to kill 100,000 Okinawan civilians before the island surrendered. They had to keep killing until almost everyone was dead. I mean, it was horrific. And the types of deaths that the people were subjected to were horrific. And so the Americans are looking at this being replicated on the home islands of Japan on a much larger scale. When they're considering, well, what is the alternative to the bomb? It's an invasion of the homelands, okay? Now, once Okinawa falls, right, that is precisely what the American government begins to prepare for, which is a invasion of the Japanese home islands. And they still, right, June 22nd, that's still about a month away from the successful detonation of that atomic bomb. So they're thinking they've got to prepare for the potential invasion of the home islands. And the estimates for casualties of American military personnel range widely from about 31,000 to about 268,000. They just didn't know how many people they were going to lose in that invasion. And certainly they had no idea how many civilians they were going to have to kill before the Japanese government would consider surrender. All right, if Okinawa was any indication, then it was going to be an enormous number of people they were going to have to kill potentially. Okay, so those are the two considerations to keep in mind when considering why there's this seeming non-opposition to Truman detonating the bomb. Okay, not justifying it, but we got to keep all these things in consideration.